click my. All right, as people will continue to filter in, we do want to take just a minute of silence to honor the victims of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki explosions. So from now until 4:05, we'll just take a moment of silence. Thank you.
Okay. Sweetie, down here where it says start video, have you been clicking that on?
Yeah.
And it still doesn't go on?
Correct. At least for the thing with the last one I did it with, which was the first one I ever did it with on that.
Alrighty, I think we can go ahead and get started. So to begin, my name is Hannah Kuriakose, and I'm a final year undergraduate student at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. I major in international studies, focusing on security, norms, and cooperation, environmental law, policy, and justice, and writing. Today we have presentations from two amazing people, Christian Ciobanu and Sarah Bidgood. And following the two presentations, we will have a roughly 30-minute Q&A session at the end. So please, throughout this presentation, feel free to type up your questions in the chat box, and we will attend to those at the end. I'm very excited to introduce Christian and Sarah today as we discuss the events of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that happened 75 years ago, as we commemorate the Hibakusha, and talk about the importance of nuclear disarmament and the role that young people and the general public can play in this initiative. To begin, Christian Ciobanu is the New York and youth representative of the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, where he's focused on youth activism. As an activist, he has organized events for the youth and diplomats in Geneva, Vienna, and New York. I will be posting the rest of his bio in the chat. Let me know if everyone can see this. Okay, awesome. And Christian, you can take the floor.
Thank you so much, Hannah, and good afternoon, everyone. I have a PowerPoint, so I'm going to share my screen with everyone now. And play from start. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this event, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Remembering 75 Years. So, on August 6, 1945, at about 8:15 local time, the US aircraft, the Enola Gay, dropped a uranium-235 gun assembly bomb nicknamed Little Boy over Hiroshima. The destruction was unlike anything in the history of warfare. Hiroshima was immediately flattened. The resulting explosion killed 70,000 people instantaneously. By December of 1945, the death toll had risen to some 140,000. In Nagasaki, on the anniversary of August 9th, 1945, at 11:02 a.m., the B-29 bomber called the Boxcar dropped a 4.5-ton plutonium bomb dubbed Fat Man. About roughly 74,000 people perished. There was no adequate response. In Hiroshima, 90% of the physicians and nurses were killed or injured. 42 out of 45 hospitals were rendered non-functional, and 70% of victims had combined injuries, including, in most cases, severe burns. All the dedicated burn beds around the world would be insufficient to care for the survivors of a single nuclear bomb in any city. I think that's, as we move forward in this presentation, it's very important for us to recognize that in the event of a nuclear attack, there can be no adequate response. health impacts. And these pictures were created by the survivors and courtesy of the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum. In 5 to 6 years after the bombing, leukemia increased substantially. After a decade, thyroid, breast, lung, and other cancers increased in higher rates than normal. Pregnant women were at a higher rate of miscarriages. Their children were more likely to have intellectual disabilities, impaired growth, and the risk of developing cancers in terms of the long-term health impacts. And we have seen, even now with third-generation Hibakusha, some of them are suffering from the health impacts of the nuclear bombs. So I want to highlight the legacy of the Hibakusha, specifically Setsuko Thurlow. So before going into the activism among the Hibakusha, I wanted to note that during the US occupation of Japan, General MacArthur issued an occupation press code, restricting Japanese journalists from reporting on anything related to the bombings or the effects of radiation, and limiting the number of foreign journalists. Official censorship would not be lifted until the end of the occupation in 1952. Some of the Hibakusha themselves at the time were unsure about speaking out. It wasn't until the Japan Council against NH bombs, which was formed September 1955, following the World Conference against A and H bomb, that Hibakusha began to speak out. And that was a direct result about what was happening in the Pacific as well with the nuclear testing. Now, fewer than 50,000 Hibakusha, who are the bomb survivors, remain, but they are determined that the horrors of atomic war will never be forgotten. Setsuko Thurlow, whose pictures are here on the slide, has devoted her entire life to activism and sharing her testimony. She co-accepted the Nobel Peace Prize with Beatrice Finn, the executive director of ICANN. And she has been amazing. This year alone, in collaboration with ICANN, Setsuko Thurlow wrote to 197 heads of states, asking them to ratify the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which was formally adopted at the UN 3 years ago. Now, I would like to show a very brief video of Setsuko Thurlow and her life. So I'm going to stop the share, and then, sorry, please bear with me. Share screen. And share computer sound.
Hibakusha or survival. Weapon has always been immoral. 私が発言しなかったら、あの原爆が一体どういうことを人類にするのか、そういうことを言う人がいなくなるんじゃないか。2人ともずるむげになっちゃって、もうやけどで人間のディグニティとかね、威厳とかそういうことなんか全然もう虫けらのように扱われて亡くなったんですね。Welcome to LBC. Thank you very much. Their presence is very important because
killed by Japanese and other innocents who were killed by Japanese, mostly Asians. Or which side do you think is more serious?
Losing life, there is no side. If you're killed, you're killed. ピーチを書く爪がなくなるんですもん。緊張しますからね。何を言おうかしらと思って書いてた。This little boy's image has come to represent in my mind all the innocent children of the world, threatened as they are at this very moment by nuclear weapons. That we Hibakusha survivors have no doubt that this treaty can and will change the world. Thank you.
So that was very powerful and very moving from Setsuko Thurlow. So I'm going back to presentation. So as discussed, she felt it was her duty to speak out about the horrific things that has been done to human beings, and that it's very important to raise awareness, especially young people, about the horrors of atomic bombings. So now I want to briefly transition into international humanitarian law. The rules of armed conflict came about from the horrors of World War II and really based on Protocol 1 of the Geneva Convention. So these are a series of the rules, and as we go through them and as I touch upon them, just bear in mind, nuclear weapons violate all of these principles, including the rule prohibiting indiscriminate attacks, the rule of proportionality, which emphasis on incidental loss of civilian life, injuries to civilians, damage to civilian objects or a combination thereof is prohibited. Rule on the protection of the natural environment, in which case all feasible precautions must be taken to avoid, in any event, minimize incidental damage to the environment. Nuclear weapons, as we've seen in the footage about Hiroshima and the pictures regarding Nagasaki, they violate this core principle, as well as the obligation to take feasible precautions in attack, in which sides have to provide, constant care must be taken to spare the civilian populations, civilians, and civilian objects. So moving forward, there has been questions regarding the legality of the threat or use of nuclear weapons. And so the General Assembly in the 90s of the UN in the 1990s asked the court to render an advisory opinion to answer the question, is the threat or use of nuclear weapons in any circumstance permitted under international law? The decision was, and this is what the judges discussed, that the threat or use of nuclear weapons would generally be contrary to humanitarian and other international law regulating the conduct of warfare. They were undecided in the case of the self-preservation of the state. What was interesting, and we'll elaborate further in this presentation, in terms of the NPT in Article 6 that deals with nuclear disarmament, the judges, the ICJ rendered that states must pursue in good faith and bring to a conclusion of negotiations leading to nuclear disarmament in all its aspects under strict and effective international control. So now I would like to transition over to the NPT. The NPT opened for signature on the 1st of July, 1968, and entered into force on 5th of March, 1970. At its core is something called the Grand Bargain, which is a pact which calls on the nuclear weapon states to initiate negotiations to eliminate their arsenals, not to assist efforts by non-nuclear weapons to acquire nuclear weapons, and at the same time, the NPT requires the non-nuclear weapon states to forego the acquisition of nuclear weapons and to place all of their facilities under international safeguards. And in the presentation, I would like to underscore and emphasize the importance of Article 6, in which each of the parties to the treaty undertakes to pursue negotiations in good faith and effective measures relating to the cessation of the nuclear arms race in an early date and to nuclear disarmament, and on a treaty on general and complete disarmament under strict and effective international control. So in theory, under this treaty, the nuclear weapon states are supposed to pursue nuclear disarmament. So they were been in a bit of a quagmire situation. Alone in 2019, the nuclear weapon states have spent combined about $72.9 billion on maintaining and modernizing their nuclear weapons, about $138,700 every minute on weapons that cause catastrophic human harm, rather than spending that money to protect the health of their citizens. And I could share from a study and discussion by a Harvard professor, her name is Bonnie Doherty, in which she explains the NPT prohibited proliferation but did not require an immediate end to possession. The NPT limited the spread of nuclear weapons, but in the process, it preserved the hierarchy of haves and have-nots. While non-nuclear weapon states agreed not to obtain nuclear weapons states have kept their nuclear arsenals. And even under Article 6, they agreed to work in good faith towards nuclear disarmament, but little progress has been done on that front. Some of them claim the conditions are not yet right, or they have to go through a gradual step-by-step process in order to achieve nuclear disarmament. And at the same time, there were discussions of having a nuclear weapons convention. A draft resolution was presented by Malaysia and Costa Rica, but again, the nuclear weapon states were unwilling to really engage in a substantive dialogue. So this is where NGOs, coalitions have been coming together to really raise awareness. So this is the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, ICAN, which is a coalition of NGOs, about 570 partner organizations in over 100 countries, promoting the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and dedicated to stigmatizing, prohibiting, and eliminating nuclear weapons. And it began in Australia, and it was launched in Austria in April 2007, and is really inspired by the international campaign to ban landmines. So what I really, appreciate about ICAN and Nuclear Age Peace Foundation is a partner organization of ICAN is that they really focus on, shifting the paradigm away from discussions about nuclear weapons in terms of national security towards a human security approach, and emphasizing what has happened to the Hibakusha and the victims of nuclear testing, especially in the Pacific and elsewhere. So this slide is highlighting the humanitarian approach. In 2010 at the NPT Review Conference, the conference recognized the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of any use of nuclear weapons and reaffirmed the need for all states at all times to comply with applicable international law, including international humanitarian law. And this is very important because all the state parties agreed, and this was included in the final outcome document. And through that, there has been an emergence of the humanitarian initiative, which really helped to demystify, nuclear weapons. And as I mentioned before, at every opportunity, ICAN has really, and its supporters, highlighted the horrors of nuclear weapons and the harm caused by the past use and testing of nuclear weapons, especially at the 3 humanitarian conferences that were held in Oslo, Nayarit, and Vienna. And this is a picture that you see of young people at the Nayarit conference, raising awareness about the importance of banning nuclear weapons. I should highlight that at the end of, through this process, there were 2 open-ended working groups with the recommendation to the General Assembly to convene a conference on establishing a legally binding instrument to prohibit nuclear weapons. So the path forward in nuclear disarmament is the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. It prohibits development, testing, producing, manufacturing, transferring, possessing, stockpiling, using, or threatening to use nuclear weapons, or allowing nuclear weapons to be stationed on state parties' territories. It also prohibits them from assisting, encouraging, or inducing anyone to do the above. In addition to these prohibitions, there were a set of articles known as the positive obligations to really address the victims of nuclear weapons, as well as to address the contaminated environment. And this was very important for several states, including the Pacific states who have been impacted by nuclear testing, to really have these provisions in there to adequately provide assistance to their citizens. So in addition to these sets, there's also additional provisions in terms of how nuclear weapon states can join. They will destroy and join with, they can cooperate with a competent international authority designated by the treaty for verification, join and destroy, remove their nuclear weapons from operational status, and submit a time-bound plan within 60 days. So in addition, at the conclusion of the negotiations, Setsuko Thurlow, who I have mentioned before, gave a very compelling and powerful statement. And ICANN actually animated the presentation, so I will now show it. 1 second.
Delegates, NGO colleagues, dear friends, I never thought I would see this moment. I would like to share my gratitude for the exceptional work and dedication of everyone who has put their brains and their hearts into these treaty negotiations. I'm grateful to you, Madam President, for your leadership, and the UN Secretariat, the delegations and NGOs devoted to moving us ever closer to the goal of the total elimination of nuclear weapons. As we gather in our celebration of this extraordinary achievement, let us pause for a moment to feel the witness of those who perished in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Both at that time in August 1945 and over these 72 years, hundreds of thousands of people. Each person who died had a name. Each person was loved by someone. I've been waiting for this day for 7 decades, and I am overjoyed that it has finally arrived. This is the beginning of the end of nuclear weapons. I remember back in 2014 when many of us met in Nayarit, Mexico. The conference chair said, "This is a point of no return. We will not return to the failed nuclear deterrence policies. We will not return to funding nuclear violence instead of human needs. We will not return to irreversibly contaminating our environment. We will not continue to risk the life of future generations." To the leaders of the countries across the world, I beseech you, if you love this planet, you will sign this treaty. Nuclear weapon has always been immoral. Now they are also illegal. Together, let us go forth and change the world. I thank you.
Very powerful. So going back to the presentation. So Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. It needs 50 states to ratify for it to enter into force. 44 states have ratified. 82 states have signed it. Updates, 3 nations have ratified it during the Hiroshima anniversary. Includes Ireland, Nigeria, Nauru has exceeded. And then today, St. Kitts and Nevis ratified the UN, the TPNW. And this was very important that today, marking 75 years since the US dropped an atomic bomb on the city of Nagasaki, killing more than 74,000 people and inflicting harm across generations. This state has ratified the TPNW in honor of the victims and the survivors of the attack. So in terms of, I was thinking in terms of what's really relevant for myself as a citizen of the US, I was really taught about nuclear weapons through like a national security lens and not through a humanitarian approach. So I never really learned about the amount of money that was spent. And I was really surprised, even like, researching for this, researching in the past, and even for this presentation, and ICANN has put out for this year about how much the US has spent and for this year alone, which is $35.1 billion, which is roughly twice as much as France and the United Kingdom. And ICANN presented a very important infographic and breakdown of what that $35.1 billion could be used. For instance, for a number of 300,000 beds in intensive care, 35,000 ventilators, 150,000 nurses, and 75,000 doctors. So this puts things into perspective, especially during the time of COVID-19. In terms of youth activism on the TPNW, in mid-February of 2020, Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, the Peace Action Fund of New York State, Nuclear Ban US, Treaty Awareness Campaign, the International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, brought 15 students to the ICANN Paris Forum, where the students learned about the risks and consequences of nuclear weapons, detoxing, how to deal with deterrence, how activists can work with government leaders and members of the financial community, and also how art can be used as a social justice tool. And they also had an opportunity to meet and to engage with prominent activists and Setsuko Hiro, the very powerful Hibakusha activists. So now, what we're doing is that we're launching a very unique program called Reverse the Trend, Save Our People, Save Our Planet, which is really focused on creating a global youth advocacy network and a docu-series. And we're working with a series of NGO partners, including Bomb Shelter, the Lawyers Committee on Nuclear Policy, 0 Hour, New York City, which is very exciting as we engage with climate activists, and Amplify, and other youth groups as well. And as we are building this advocacy network, as I mentioned, we have this docu-series, and the first episode of the docu-series, which will be premiered in January, hopefully at the review conference of the NPT, will be on the legacy of nuclear testing in the Pacific. And we're working very closely with the Marshall Islands Student Association at the University of the South Pacific. And we were very pleased that this project is being supported by the Prospect Hill Foundation. So this is really an amazing initiative to really empower and to amplify the voices of young people from communities that have been impacted by both nuclear weapons and climate change. That is the end of my presentation. Thank you so much. You can follow us on Facebook, on Twitter, and Instagram, NAF New York, and our email is nafnewyork@gmail.com. And Hannah has provided my email address and also the sign-up form for more information about our project. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Christian, and for sharing the powerful videos. In the chat box, I have shared a little link regarding more information on Reverse the Trend. Next, we have our presentation from Sarah Bidgood. She's the director of the Eurasia Nonproliferation Program at the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies in Monterey, California. Her research focuses on US-Soviet and US-Russia nonproliferation cooperation, as well as the international nonproliferation regime more broadly. She's the co-editor of the book, Once and Future Partners, the United States, Russia, and Nuclear Nonproliferation, which was published by the International Institute for Strategic Studies in 2018. She also leads the Young Women in Nonproliferation Initiative at CNS, of which I am a part of. You have the floor now.
Great, thank you so much, Hannah, and thank you again for the opportunity to speak on this very important topic. Christian, thank you for your presentation as well. It's always a pleasure to take the floor after you, so thank you again for a really stimulating series of remarks. Hannah, I'm gonna attempt to share my screen here, so just hang on for 1 second while I get my little PowerPoint going. Okay, here we go. So I just have a couple of slides, and I'm not really going to focus so exclusively on them. I'm going to, read you some remarks and share a little bit of my perspective, in particular about ways that young people can get involved in some of these issues. It's a topic that's really near and dear to my heart. It's how I met Hannah, and so I'm going to try to focus my kind of remarks on following the conclusions that Christian drew upon, and provide some of my own perspectives as well. So. I think that the need for kind of greater engagement and greater diversity around the nuclear policy conversations that we have in a lot of these spaces is an important one, and it's an issue that I talk about quite frequently. But I think it's all the more salient against the backdrop of the somber occasion that we're marking as part of this conversation that Hannah has organized, and in the ways that Christian and Hannah have described in their introductory remarks. Of course, although nuclear weapons have only been used twice in war, as Christian described, we're faced with an international environment today where I think the possibility of nuclear use is arguably higher than it's been really at any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis. As somebody who focuses a great deal on US-Russia issues, those two countries are embarking on a nuclear arms race. I think, as all of us know who follow these issues, the sort of future of arms control is at best uncertain. And at the same time, these international mechanisms that were established to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons are really in desperate need of strengthening. And I think, as Christian's remarks kind of highlighted in particular, there are deep divisions between states about the ways to move forward towards a world free of nuclear weapons that are becoming more entrenched, that are intensifying, and it's more difficult to see how there might be a kind of shared perspective on the ways to move forward. For me then, as an American in particular, it's really troubling that at the same time that all of this is happening, at least in our country, there's very little public discourse, I would say, on nuclear weapons issues. Those of us who are based in the United States have seen this kind of firsthand in some of the political discussions and debates that are happening in the lead up to the presidential elections. Questions relating to nuclear weapons issues have sort of taken a back seat to issues that the American voter might find more immediate. And this situation I see as being compounded by the fact that American college and high school students, and young people in particular, don't really have a lot of opportunities in their own curricula to learn about nuclear weapons issues, and to learn sort of not, to learn how to think about these issues rather than what to think about these issues in a nuanced and thoughtful way. In my own research, and this has been a focus of mine for some time because I am affiliated with an educational institution, I found that, between 2016 and 2018, the leading 75 colleges and universities within the United States only offered 524 courses that touched upon nuclear weapons issues, which, when you do the math, comes out to an average of 3.5 courses per year. For some people, you might tell them that and they would be surprised that there were even that many courses that focused on these issues, but I actually find that really, really sobering, in particular because if you compare that to the number of courses that the leading public, private, and liberal arts institutions offered on climate change, for instance, there were about 20 or 30 of those every year. So when you compare that to the 3.5 courses that on average are offered on nuclear weapons issues, that's really striking. And let me be very clear that I don't mean in any way to imply that climate change issues aren't hugely important. They are important, but the point that I'm making here is that we treat these two existential threats in very different ways in our educational system, at least here in the United States. And I think that that is shaping the way that we talk about and the discourse or lack of discourse that we have on nuclear policy issues in general. So for me, again, all of this kind of contributes to an environment where there isn't a lot of conversation that's happening around nuclear policy issues already. And the young people who are going to be affected by these decisions don't necessarily have all of the tools or the resources that they might need to be able to, think critically or feel like they have agency in this process. And I find that to be really troubling. So this is troubling, but I don't actually find it to be all that surprising. And for those of us who work in this space, I think we know when we engage with our families, if we go home for a break or whatever it is, that nuclear weapons issues and nuclear war in particular feel like remote and inaccessible issues to a lot of people. And it makes it really hard for somebody who doesn't focus on these issues in a professional way to engage with them and to feel like, yes, my viewpoint matters, my perspective matters on these issues. I think in part, you can chalk that up to the fact that the language that we use to talk about nuclear issues is really kind of hard to get a handle on. Christian and I went to the same institution for our master's degrees. And I remember when I came to this field, I had focused previously really on US-Russia issues. And it took me, there's a steep learning curve to learn the vocabulary that goes into being able to have a conversation about these issues and to kind of understand all of the acronyms. And that's really intimidating. And that's difficult, I think, for people in particular who aren't, engaging in this discourse every single day of their lives. I think, though, that it's also because, at least in the United States at the moment, we're in the midst of really important and necessary conversations about, civil rights issues, about systemic racism. Regardless of where you are, the COVID-19 pandemic is certainly at the forefront of people's minds. And I can understand why, for many, many people, it just feels like nuclear weapons issues may not be as kind of pressing as this onslaught of other crises that we're dealing with. But I also think that we can attribute this kind of state of affairs to the fact that the threat of nuclear war is not as front and center in people's minds in the ways that it might have been in the past. The Cold War is over. Nuclear weapons have not been used in 75 years, as we've been describing on this call. But my fear is that this kind of combination of factors is misleading people into thinking that the threats posed by nuclear weapons are somehow, have somehow gone away, or that they can be managed just by the mechanisms that we have in place right now. And in my view, that's not really the correct conclusion to reach, especially as the international security environment is becoming increasingly strained. The arms control architecture is being dismantled, as I alluded to at the top of my remarks. And we have new technologies that are emerging that have not been a traditional part of the nuclear discourse, and that our nuclear discourse isn't necessarily kind of equipped to address. So this isn't a static landscape, and I think if people don't feel like they have the tools and the resources or the imperative to engage in conversations around these issues, we can be lulled into really a false sense of security that I think is quite dangerous. So, with this very gloomy landscape in mind that I've just painted for you, I think it's essential to engage, more diverse voices in conversations around nuclear policy if we are striving to achieve a world free of nuclear weapons, which I think, I guess everybody on this call is. Now, when I say more diverse, I'm reacting to the fact that the nuclear policy community is really comprised primarily of white men. So there is a racial and a sort of gender homogeneity here that I think inhibits creative thinking and stands in the way of achieving better outcomes. And there's a great deal of research that I've talked about sort of ad nauseum on many of these calls that points to the importance of having greater gender diversity and racial diversity in particular in stimulating creative thinking and in finding solutions to the really difficult problems that I think pose the greatest threats to humanity, and that certainly includes nuclear weapons issues. So you can see here on the screen, these are just some kind of illustrations here, but in general, since I tend to focus in my own work in particular on gender diversity and the need for gender diversity in our field, you can see that the National Nuclear Security Administration workforce in 2018, and I don't have the latest statistics from 2019, only about 33% of the workforce is comprised of women. There was a really excellent report that came out in 2018 that looked at researchers at DC-based think tanks that focus on security issues, not specifically nuclear, but security issues in general. And those top researchers, the sort of most senior ones of those, only 27% of them or so on average are women. And then even at the TPNW negotiations, 31% of the registered delegates were women. And so I think that treaty is unique because it talks about the importance of gender diversity in particular in achieving better outcomes. But I think I'm providing this as an illustration of the fact that this is really a systemic challenge that our field has to grapple with, and it doesn't just apply to one sector, government, the think tank sector, or the diplomacy, international diplomacy space. So just to sort of provide a note of illustration there. But I'm also, when I'm talking about the importance of greater diversity, I'm also, reacting to the fact that the individuals and institutions that develop and enact policy, at least in my country, in the United States, many of them are quickly approaching retirement age. So it's an aging community of practitioners. And you can see that actually here on this slide. By 2023, 40% of those self-same employees to whom I just referred at the NNSA will be eligible to retire. That doesn't mean they will retire, but it means they'll be eligible. 80% of the senior civil servants at the State Department will be eligible to retire by that same period of time. And at the same time, you also have the number of Americans who are taking the Foreign Service exam falling quite significantly in the last couple of years. So at least from my perspective as somebody who is really interested in helping the next generation kind of find their space in this discourse, I see that landscape as something that creates an imperative to empower this next generation, help them develop the skills to think critically about nuclear challenges, and also create an environment where they feel like their voices are going to be heard and respected and taken seriously. So for me, this was the inspiration behind the Young Women in Nonproliferation Initiative, of which Hannah is a part and that she kindly mentioned in her intro. That's a program that I lead at CNS, and the goal is to encourage undergraduate women at US colleges and universities to consider careers in disarmament, in nonproliferation, in arms control, in all of these aspects of nuclear policy. And as part of those efforts, I also lead a mentorship program where I pair undergraduate women with leading experts in the field who share their same interests. And Hannah is one of our wonderful mentees, and Tony Jaquez, who is on the line, I believe, as well, is Hannah's mentor. So that has been just a really, I think, tremendous and really rewarding way to kind of help create this cadre of next generation experts who have the tools and the skills and the motivation that they need to tackle these enduring challenges. When I do this work and when I speak with undergraduates, part of what I try to drive home in particular kind of on the theme of diversity is not just that, obviously we need socioeconomic diversity among experts, we need racial diversity, we need ethnic diversity, we need gender diversity, but we also need a real diversity of disciplines and a diversity of interests. And I remember one of the things that really surprised me when I came to this field was, I kind of felt like I'm perhaps running the risk of pigeonholing myself by focusing so narrowly on kind of non-proliferation, arms control, and disarmament issues. There's this whole world of other challenges. Am I limiting my scope of vision? And I was very pleasantly surprised to find that, in fact, non-proliferation for me as a researcher has served as a lens through which to examine a lot of other issues that I feel very passionate about and that I really care about. And so, sometimes in my work, as I try to highlight for our students, I focus on, history, I focus on, aspects of anthropology, of sociology. A lot of my colleagues work a great deal with, geography or sort of geospatial analysis, things like that. I've even done projects where I'm looking at literature, at the visual arts. Christian, you mentioned your work with Bomb Shelter. I mean, that's the same type of thing where you're kind of bringing in a whole different realm of perspectives and ways of describing and helping people engage with these challenges that I think are really important. So all of that is to say, I try to really drive home to students that, focusing on nuclear issues and focusing on nuclear policy is a way to bring in these other issues that you really care about. And in a sense, I hate to call us, lucky in our field, but I suppose that because this challenge is so all-encompassing and requires so many different perspectives and interests, that there actually are a lot of points of engagement that I would encourage young people in particular who are interested in this issue to kind of explore. So I do just want to say, I feel very lucky not to be alone in this work, and there are a lot of groups who are working really hard both to empower young people to think critically about these issues, but also to create practitioner spaces that support greater diversity, whether it's racial diversity or gender diversity or what have you. And these include women of color advancing peace and security. They include gender champions in nuclear policy. Those are both US-based organizations, but they're ones that I really admire, and I tremendously admire the work that they're doing. I think it's very substantive. And then I also, feel lucky to be surrounded by many people at my own institution at CNS who care very deeply about the issue of disarmament and non-proliferation education and taking forward those commitments and really putting them into practice. I think there's a lot about the current global circumstances that make me feel quite pessimistic, but this is an area where I feel a real sense of optimism about the future and lucky to be in such good company. So I know I'm kind of taking up a lot of time here, but Hannah, you did ask me to talk a little bit about the ways that different communities can get involved in some of these issues. I've been giving kind of a view from 30,000 feet, but just in terms of practical perspectives, how can different audiences who might be on our call here think about being engaged in these issues? So for practitioners in particular, I think encouraging greater diversity through outreach and mentorship is something that we can all very easily take part of. It's easy to carve out time in our day to talk to a student, to respond to a student, to respond to a person from the general public who's interested in some of these issues. And I personally believe that that's sort of part of my mandate in my work is to make time to have those important conversations. It's not just about writing the paper or engaging with policymakers. It's about engaging with people who have a right to have a part in all of these conversations. I have often thought it would be a really tremendously impactful thing if everybody who was working in this space carved out the time to give one talk at their home institution, their alma mater or their high school in their hometown, wherever it is. I think that could make a real difference in helping the next generation not just feel like they're a little bit better versed on some of these issues, but feel like they know a person who can help kind of shepherd them through the process of pursuing a career in this field or just deepening their interest. So that's something I would love to see happen. And I do try to do that, in my own work. For students in particular, as I sort of highlighted previously in my work, I do know that it's really challenging at least US institutions of higher education to take classes where you're kind of learning about these issues in a focused way. There just aren't that many of them. But if you don't feel like your institution has offered you opportunities to do that type of deep work, I'd encourage you to kind of pick paper topics or pick essay topics or homework topics or whatever it is that kind of focus on the intersection of your particular interests and the nuclear policy space. Because as I hope I've driven home here, those issues really sit at this nexus of humanities, STEM, and policy in a very unique way that I think provides a lot of access points. So I know that's not always the most satisfying approach to feel like you need to kind of do the legwork and educate yourselves, but fortunately there are a lot of great resources out there, and I'm always happy to kind of share some of those if you'd like that. For professors, I don't know if we have any faculty who are on the line here, but for the same reasons that I think I've tried to highlight throughout this presentation, it's worth trying to examine ways to introduce WMD topics into your courses that already exist. I know, particularly in this environment, it is a huge ask to try to get people to develop new courses that focus in particular on nuclear issues. But, consider ways to use nuclear policy as a case study in your course. Christian, you were talking about international humanitarian law. I mean, there are ways to incorporate some nuclear issues into a lot of different types of case studies that I think can expose students and at least get them intrigued and interested in some of these issues in particular. So that would be one, I think, a fairly easy recommendation that I think if you're involved in that higher education space, we might consider. And then for everybody, and I'm really inspired here by Hannah's work, think about ways that you can write op-eds, right? Even if it's just to your local paper. I know that, local journalism isn't the way that it has always been in the past, but if you have a local newspaper and you feel like you want to say something about nuclear weapons issues, you can make your voice heard in that particular way, and you can make, your perspectives known to your, representatives and to your community in a fairly easy way by writing an op-ed or writing a piece for your local paper. You can also organize dialogues, exactly like what Hannah has done here. So I'm really proud of her, and I'm so proud that she took the initiative to make this happen. And I think that can also be a great way for students or anybody who's a member of the general public to engage with the practitioner community on some of these issues as well. So I encourage you to explore ways to do that. And most of all, don't be afraid to reach out to people. I get lots of emails from students who are interested in this topic, who want to have a conversation about it, who just want to learn more, want some reading recommendations. I'm always happy to do that. And I don't know anybody who isn't. Christian, I'm sure you get the same types of inquiries. And so it can be really intimidating to try to cold email someone who you don't know. But I think the people that I interact with in our community love to get emails like that. So I would just encourage any of you who are kind of thinking about perhaps pursuing a career in this field or just want to get more involved in it to not be shy about doing that and to reach out. So just to kind of bring everything all together and to tie this back into the conversation that we've been having here, the question of why all of this matters and why we do this work is something that I think is really important to drive home, and that's kind of how I want to wrap up my formal remarks here. The devastating humanitarian consequences of the use of nuclear weapons and a recognition of the fact that nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought is something that personally drives me in my work. And while there are a lot of different ways to contribute to bringing about a world free of nuclear weapons, some of which I've tried to highlight here and some of which Christian has highlighted, we can't kind of lose sight of the reasons why it is that we're doing what we're doing. And for me personally, that is something I try to think about a lot in my own work. So two of my wonderful CNS colleagues, Masako Toki and Brianna Tyson-Krieger, whom some of you may know, recently wrote an op-ed for our local Monterey paper where they talked about the importance of engagement between the hibakusha and the next generation of nuclear experts. And so I thought I'd just kind of end my formal remarks here by reading an excerpt from that op-ed that really resonated with me. And so in this section of the op-ed, they're talking about the crucial contributions of young people to kind of dismantling systems of oppression across all different dimensions of our society, but including with respect to nuclear policy. And they write, as you can see on the screen, that's why we continue to engage young people in disarmament and nonproliferation education and to practice a cross-generational approach to change. From our elders, we hear the warnings of horrors unimaginable, the all too possible consequences of technology and weaponry run amok. From our youth, we draw from a seemingly bottomless well of urgency, agency, will, and courage to envision new systems of cooperation. And they talk in particular in this op-ed about cross-generational and trans-boundary empathy and the reasons why it is that we need to practice that and to bring that dimension into our work. So both with that kind of, I like this because I think it captures a sense of kind of practicality and realism as well as optimism. And so I think on that note, I will end my remarks by just thanking Hannah again for organizing this conversation. And I'm really looking forward to kind of a freewheeling discussion about some of what we brought up here. So thanks, Hannah.
Thank you both so much for your very informative and detailed presentations. I know you both are surely receiving a large virtual round of applause. We will now be opening up the floor for our brief 30-minute Q&A session. So please do send any questions you may have in the chat. And I actually think we may have one. Let's see. All right, I think this is to both Christian and Sarah from Pranav. They were wondering if a better, more widespread understanding of the existential threat posed by nuclear war shown through the Godzilla movie or other works of art would be helpful in spreading awareness of the issues of nuclear nonproliferation.
Should answer first. Sarah, would you like to go first?
Christian, why don't you take it away and then I'll gather my thoughts.
Sure. So I actually read the New York Times. There was an article in the New York Times like last night about the Godzilla movies. And I thought it was really interesting because they talked about what has happened in terms of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and how, in fact, in the original Godzilla movie, there's a reference to nuclear weapons and the radiation, the effects that it had on the monster itself. And they compared it and they juxtaposed it to the newer versions of the Godzilla, in which the American directors, the producers, they completely ignored that link and they removed that from the story. So I think that shows that American public is not yet ready to or has difficulty in accepting what the U.S. government did to the survivor, did to the to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the implications of the U.S. Nuclear weapons in broader terms. I do think that generally art and film are very important mediums to talk about nuclear weapons and to really engage with a wider audience who are not policy experts. And that's something that at Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, through our collaboration with Bomb Shelto, particularly with Lovely Umayam, that we're really trying to showcase and highlight nuclear weapons through the creation of a docu-series using stop motion animation. Yes.
I agree with that completely, Christian. I don't have much to add here other than just to say that I do think, it's important to have an understanding of the ways that different audiences can engage with these issues. And I apologize for sounding like a broken record because that's something that I really tried to highlight in my remarks. But, film can be a great way to do that. Video games can be a great way to do that. For some people, the visual arts can be a fantastic way to do that. There are even ballets and theater performances and poetry that deal with nuclear issues. So, I would be reluctant to exclude, any form of discourse about these particular issues or points of entry for people with different interests. And I think, movies like Godzilla can be a great way to do that too. So I fully support what you said.
Thank you, Pranav, for the question. We have another one from Jeremy stating the intellectual leaders of many major religious groups, various Christian denominations, including the Catholic Church, also many strands of Islam and Judaism, have condemned the use and even possession of nuclear weapons. However, adherents to these faiths often do not actively support these teachings or even remain unaware to them. How can nuclear disarmament activists increase engagement with these faith-based communities? How can activists leverage cross-border religious ties to build transnational communities in favor of nuclear disarmament?
Christian, I'm going to let you tackle that one too, because I think you have a better lock on the sort of activism community and what that might look like.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. So in terms of engagement with religious communities, I know the World Council of Churches and Religions for Peace have both been very active in terms of discussing nuclear disarmament, participating in webinars, as well as the Holy See. For anyone who's been on this call and who may have watched the Peace Memorial Service last night in Nagasaki, there were references to Pope Francis's visit to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, in which he really talked about the moral and ethical dimensions surrounding nuclear disarmament, nuclear weapons. I think that there needs to be broader discussion, that we need to like be able to like reach out to different religious communities, organize events with them, and also engage with practitioners. I know that even in like some of the nuclear weapon states, I think I heard like in France, many French clergy persons were reluctant to like convey messages by Pope Francis regarding nuclear disarmament. And the issue will be like, how do we sit down with those groups and really engage and have like substantive dialogues with them? And I know that's something that, ICANN has been like, addressing, in particular like ICANN France, the French religious communities, Catholic communities, I should say, as well as, in terms of like Religions for Peace and the World Parliament of Religions.
All right, thank you so much for that question, Jeremy. If anyone else has a question, please do feel free to type it in the chat. Oh, I think there's another question. Oh, that was just a comment. Thank you. All right, I do have a question specifically for you, Sarah. As you lead the Young Women in Nonproliferation Initiative at CNS, I was wondering if you'd be able to explain a little more of the gendered impacts of nuclear weapons, both in Hiroshima and Nagasaki and in general.
Sure, Hannah, thank you for that question. This is an important topic for me and one I focus on a great deal. There are a lot of ways that we can look at sort of the gendered impact of nuclear issues. And I tend to see, I think, sort of three of them that I focus on in particular in my work. The first one is the literal physical impact of, the use of nuclear weapons, the development of nuclear weapons testing, all of those different components of the nuclear enterprise. We know from really wonderful research that's been carried out by our friends at UNIDIR that there are specific cancers in particular, Christian highlighted some of these as well in his remarks, that tend to affect women more than men just because of the biological makeup and the way our reproductive systems work and all kinds of things like that. Those are the results of stochastic ionizing radiation, and they do disproportionately impact women in ways that they don't impact men. So that's certainly something that the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki helped to or illustrated, but they've also been reinforced by other research that's been conducted subsequently. And if you guys are interested in that, I encourage you to check out some of the work that UNIDIR has done. But there are also, I see these two other kind of related issues with respect to the ways that gender plays into these discussions that we've been having here. One is equity and fairness. So, I believe that, and this pertains to not just gender diversity, but racial and socioeconomic diversity and all types of diversity. We would all be impacted by any use of nuclear weapons. And therefore, in my view, we all have a right to be a part of the conversation about the policymaking that governs the use and possession of nuclear weapons. And so I see having an equitable table where people with different perspectives and different backgrounds get to weigh in on these conversations as something that is really part and parcel of having an equitable world where we have dismantled some of these systemic barriers to discussion. So that's another way in which I think gender plays into these conversations. And then the third way is related to outcomes. And so we have a lot of great research that from the private sector in particular that illustrates the ways in which greater gender diversity can lead to better outcomes. And I don't think anybody on this call would argue that the nuclear weapons space is not a place where we want the best possible outcomes that we can achieve. And there are a couple of reasons why this is the case. One of them is the fact that women and men are, gender is a construct, but we are acculturated to behave differently from one another. And I think there are different perspectives that result from that are very important to have in a conversation about nuclear weapons. And we're better able to kind of challenge each other and confront our own preconceptions when we are engaging with people who are not like us. And then the other reason too, I think, is that somebody who does not look like you or doesn't seem like you or doesn't speak like you might have a completely different perspective about these issues that cause you to think about them in ways that you never ever did before. And sort of excluding people from those conversations a priori, without any, sense for what their qualifications are or anything besides their gender, I think really does our community a disservice. And so that's part of the reason why I wanted to focus on this early part of the pipeline with my initiative and to find ways to encourage students before they have embarked on a career to look at this as something that they might explore.
Thank you for sharing that. Very important for sure. We have a question from Tony, both to Christian and Sarah, and she wants to hear more about the very common views and beliefs regarding nuclear weapons not being a threat as important as other issues in the present time, such as that of climate change or COVID-19.
Christian, you want to go first?
Sure, I'll go first. I'll try to tackle this. So in terms of, it is true that like many like young people that we try to like engage with, many of them feel that, that climate change or COVID-19 or that's in a way they try to create like a hierarchy of like what's important, not recognizing that, in order to tackle, nuclear weapons, we also have to tackle, climate change as well. There's like there's a relationship between the two. And that's what we're trying to highlight here at the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation. We've had events in which we brought in Marshallese youth to talk about the relationship between both climate change and, nuclear weapons in terms of what has been happening in their country, in terms of the dome, the Ruinette Dome that has been cracking and could be leaking radiation into the ocean, which bridged the divide, as well as the horrors of nuclear winter. And for us, what we're doing in order to like bridge the divide as well, we're creating an online curriculum in which, we're inviting both climate change activists and nuclear activists to work together to create this curriculum, and then to address the convergence of the two issues together. And we're hoping that this will be a very important resource for both high school seniors as well as freshmen and sophomore college students to really, engage on these issues first and second years. And this is something that we've been doing through the Reverse the Trend project, and we'll be highlighting on a website that we're developing as well.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Christian. And I think, Tony, you even in asking your question, I think you've hit the nail on the head that there's a tendency to kind of have there be a siloing of issues, but we know that, all of these issues are intersecting in important ways. For instance, in addition to what Christian was saying, there have also been some good articles in Forbes that have come out in the last, year or so that talk about how rising sea levels could actually, affect certain, nuclear installations and things like that. So there are these really very literal junctures where climate change issues and nuclear weapons issues go hand in hand. I think as well, though, one of the challenges that I think with respect to our own work in nuclear policy is that with climate change, I, as just an individual, feel like there are steps that I can take to reduce my impact on the climate or reduce my carbon footprint. I can recycle, I can, decide not to take a plane or do whatever it is. It's more difficult to find those individual spaces of accountability when it comes to nuclear weapons issues. There's not something that I feel like I can do or change in my own individual life that is necessarily going to impact the discussion. And Christian, I know that you probably have, some perspectives about that as well from an activism perspective. But this is why I encourage people to write. I encourage you to, make your views heard, look for ways to engage in discussions with your policymakers if that's important to you, or with the general public or with your community. And I think so I guess from the perspective of, thinking about ways to capture the sort of imagination and energy of the next generation in the ways that the climate change discussion has, I think, very successfully and rightfully done. It's worth thinking about, how can we kind of learn from the success of that experience and help channel it towards nuclear issues as well.
Thank you both so much for that. I think we have a follow-up question from Pranav. Regarding the original Godzilla movie as a direct reflection on Japanese nationalism and imperialism, and it showed how nuclear bombings show the fragility and uselessness of such standpoints in the face of such destruction. while the American directors, as well as later iterations of these movies, seem to focus on either showing value of such monsters clashing or about how humans have ruined the planet through pollution and indiscriminate practices. So I think Pranav was wondering if a more nuanced and Western recontextualization will be any more impactful than what it is somewhat esoteric as far as a lived experience among the affected is concerned.
So I guess if it's okay, Sarah, I'll try to answer this question. I actually sent in a message about an NBC article about Godzilla, and I think I can discuss this like overall. I think it would be important, especially not so much like what they found in the article they talked about, is that many Westerners are not yet, or Western Hollywood companies do not want to, or at least yet, like depict or like blame the U.S. or talk about like the atrocities of the U.S. cause during World War II, especially with the bombings. I think it would be important if, you know, Japanese or creative artists would want to try to make a sequel or to discuss like a remake of Godzilla. I know in the article, which I can share, is that because of the American occupation of the country at that time, Japanese citizens, producers, and so couldn't really talk about nuclear weapons. So like Japanese creative artists, filmmakers, and novelists couldn't easily talk about these subjects. It was a topic that could not be discussed. But you know, when the Japanese had their independence back, and filmmakers began thinking about like giant monsters, Godzilla, individuals and artists began to think about the connection between the monsters and the atomic bombings. And I'll share the link here from ANBC actually, and explaining how Godzilla was a metaphor for Hiroshima.
Christian, thank you for explaining that. I have to say it's been a very, very long time since I saw Godzilla, but you're prompting me to revisit. And Pranav, I'm not sure that I have a lot to add to what Christian said. I thought that was interesting and edifying for myself. So I'll let you two correspond about that.
Yeah, I will say, and just really briefly, that in the article that I just shared the link, it says like in the original Japanese film, the creature Godzilla was portrayed as a surviving dinosaur from the Jurassic period, swimming around the South Pacific. The monster was just as innocent as the kids on their playgrounds in Hiroshima. After an American H-bomb, test in the South Pacific, this creature became radiated, hurt, and angry. So really, showing the connections also with nuclear testing in the Pacific as well.
Thank you for that. I do have a question for both of you, and I wonder how capable do you think that the International Atomic Energy Commission may be in making sure nuclear power is used for peaceful purposes? So in other words, how capable do you think the IAEA of the UN is in maintaining nuclear material to ensure its use simply for civil or commercial uses alone, and being able to determine if countries surreptitiously divert their enriched uranium or plutonium materials for or to create nuclear arms?
Christian, I can take a stab at this one since you've been doing the heavy lifting here with these last few comments, if you want. So in my view, I think the International Atomic Energy Agency is supremely capable in making sure that equipment and material that is intended for peaceful purposes remains peaceful. And just to add an additional layer of nuance to a very short answer to my question, I'll kind of get back to a point that Christian made in his presentation where he talked about the grand bargain between the nuclear weapon states and the non-nuclear weapon states. And I'll add that in addition to the work that the IAEA does to prevent the diversion of peaceful nuclear material and equipment to military purposes, it also helps to kind of make good on the promise enshrined in that grand bargain for the non-nuclear weapon states, which is that they have the inalienable right to access the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. And so in addition to the work that the IAEA does as kind of the nuclear watchdog, as it's often called in the media, they also have the Technical Cooperation Fund. They do a lot of work to make sure that non-nuclear weapon states are able to take full advantage the full range of the peaceful uses of nuclear energy, which I think are sometimes not always apparent to the general public. It goes, way far beyond nuclear power plants and goes into things like cancer treatments and, eradicating mosquitoes that have malaria and things like that. So there's a whole, roster of work that the IAEA does that I think both from a literal and a normative perspective help to strengthen the non-proliferation regime in really critical ways.
Thank you for your response. I think we have time for one more question, and I do see a question posed in the chat box by Pranav, and wonders, how does nuclear power intersect with disarmament and nonproliferation, and how does climate change possibly affect these power plants? And they wonder, especially in light of the fallout of the Fukushima nuclear power plant, as well as the failure of Indian power plant in Tamil Nadu.
Sarah, if it's okay, I will try to answer this question. We don't spend a lot of time talking about nuclear power, but I can share that a lot of several Pacific states, island states, are deeply concerned about Fukushima and are concerned about discussions by the Japanese government to release the radioactive water into the Pacific, and how that will affect the Pacific Ocean, especially and their main industries as well. And Pacific states have been, we're wondering, and this is something that's still being discussed in terms of whether it can be brought up in the context of the NPT review conference itself, and whether that's an appropriate forum to discuss this matter, as they're greatly concerned about how it will affect the ecosystems around themselves. And maybe Sarah can provide more more information, or provide ideas of how this could be discussed. And it's, I think, the third committee at the review conference, and what implications would there be if this was discussed and presented in an outcome document.
Oh, Christian, that one I need to ruminate on a little bit more, but so let me put some thought into that. But the thing that I wanted to add also in just, to complement what Christian said, is that there is this bigger, conversation that happens in kind of the security studies space about, does capability automatically lead to the spread of nuclear weapons? And often that comes up in the context of conversations about, the peaceful uses of nuclear energy and reactors and power plants and things like that. And I have found it really interesting, and I think this has been backed up by both, real lived experience, but also by research, that just because a country has access to the technology that would allow them to build a nuclear weapon, for instance, or a very sophisticated peaceful nuclear energy program, does not automatically mean that that country has any interest in pursuing a nuclear weapons program. And there's an interesting graph, and I'm trying to remember exactly where it is. I think it might be in a Jacques Hyman's article that came out, several years ago, where he kind of mapped the spread of peaceful nuclear technology and then the increase in states that actually developed nuclear weapons. And it's not a parallel kind of cause and effect relationship. And in fact, when the NPT entered into force in 1970, that did help to create a normative environment where it was not okay to just start diverting your peaceful nuclear technology to military purposes. And as I'm sure you guys all know, John F. Kennedy believed that there could be as many as 20 nuclear weapon states by the end of his term in office, and that definitely didn't happen. So I just want to add, this does not, contradict or anything that what Christian said. I'm just simply adding an extra dimension to the conversation, which is that yes, it is important to talk about nuclear power in the context of nonproliferation and disarmament, but I don't want you guys to leave with the impression that just because a country, pursues nuclear power or has a very advanced nuclear power program, that is somehow an indication that they have an interest in pursuing nuclear weapons. That's not the case at all. So it's important to disaggregate those a little bit as well, I think.
Right, and I agree with Sarah's remarks, because I know that even like in countries such as Kazakhstan, with the low enriched fuel bank, it is hard to like, I think, and this is something that, you know, policymakers and experts can like explain more about, like the notion of like the peaceful use of nuclear power, and, you know, what it means if a country has a fuel bank, as well as like pursuing low enriched uranium.
Thank you for that. Christian, I'm not sure if your audio cut out at the end. I think maybe something flashed on my screen for a second. Oh, I think I can hear you. Never mind. All right, all set. I think we may have just like a couple more minutes if one of you want to tackle Noor's question regarding why countries are still developing nuclear weapons, even though it's considered inhumane, possibly out of the fear of other countries having it, or perhaps just for ranks of superiority.
Sarah, would you like to tackle this one?
Sure, I can. I mean, I think the first thing that's important to kind of note here is that there are countries who are, you know, pursuing a nuclear weapons capability, but as I indicated in my previous remarks, there are many, many, many fewer of these than was initially anticipated at sort of the beginning of the nuclear age. So just to sort of add an additional layer of nuance to that question, I don't think that we're existing in an environment where, you know, every country would be pursuing a nuclear weapons capability, except something is holding them back. For a lot of countries, particularly those in nuclear weapon-free zones, you know, they're very clearly not interested in pursuing nuclear weapons. They're members of the NPT. That's one of the most universal arms control treaties on the planet. So I don't want to leave you with the impression that that we're living in an environment where every state is interested in pursuing, you know, nuclear weapons. But for countries that you know do, and historically, when you look back at cases of, you know, why it is that countries develop nuclear weapons, I think you capture it in your question. There are deep insecurities that have, you know, historically made countries, you know, maybe think that they need a nuclear weapons capability in order to, you know, look out for their own security interests and preserve their own security interests. There is a whole literature in the sort of political science space and security study space that tries to look at the drivers behind nuclear weapons. So this is a great and you know, I could give a very long-winded and not very conclusive answer about why it is that countries do this, but certainly the security kind of dilemma that you highlight in your question is one that at least in some cases has influenced the proliferation tendencies of certain states. For others, it could be, you know, prestige. There's a technology prestige element that is sometimes highlighted in the literature as a driver. Lots of, you know, some literature highlights the personalities of different leaders. So there's a whole kind of realm of answers to give there, and I think it would be very difficult to highlight one particular thing. What we do know, though, is that the international, you know, non-proliferation and disarmament regime has done I think, successful job of preventing what we thought would be a huge explosion of nuclear weapon states. That has not proven to be the case, but obviously there is room for improvement and for strengthening there. I think that's certainly highlighted by the comments on this call.
Right, and just to like build upon what Sarah has mentioned, that in addition to the NPT architecture, we also have many states that belong to nuclear weapon-free zones and are adhering to the protocols and to the articles set forth. We have nuclear weapon-free zones in Latin America and the Caribbean, governed by Tlatelolco, South Pacific, Central Asia, and so forth. And we also have a very robust IEA, you know, safeguards regime. And many states, you know, work with the IEA very closely in terms of like, you know, allowing their inspectors to come in and to verify.
Thank you so much for that question and for both of your responses for this question and all of those asked during our Q&A session. As we finish up, I do want to sincerely thank everyone for tuning in today and taking the initiative to be a part of the conversation for nuclear nonproliferation. If you do have any questions or comments, please feel free to email me. I have sent it in the chat right now. And I want to thank my mentor, Tony, for challenging me and aiding me in putting this event together. And finally, Christian and Sarah, thank you both dearly for sharing your expertise on this issue. Your knowledge has been so invaluable to me and for all of the listeners, I'm sure, and I'm so excited to see the narrative on nuclear disarmament positively change in the near future. I do hope everyone continues to stay safe and healthy, please, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Hannah. Great job.
Bye.
Bye.